The cowboy walked barefoot across the desert to save the Apache child. What would you do if the only path to redemption lay through the scorching sands of the Sonoran Desert, and you found yourself stripped of everything but your resolve, with the life of an innocent Apache child hanging in the balance? This is the true story, or as true as the legends whispered around a flickering campfire, of a man named Silas Dust Miller, a tale that unfolds in the unforgiving heart of the Arizona Territory in the sweltering summer of 1883. It is, without a doubt, one of the most remarkable and dangerous cases of sacrifice and unexpected heroism ever etched into the annals of the American frontier. The Sonoran Desert, in the summer of '83, was a crucible forged by the sun and tempered by the relentless wind. It stretched, an endless canvas of ochre and rust, under a sky that seemed to burn with an intensity unknown to the civilized world. Saguaro cacti, ancient sentinels, pierced the azure, their arms raised in silent supplication or defiant challenge. The air shimmered, distorting the distant mountains into wavering mirages, and the only sounds were the buzz of unseen insects and the occasional mournful cry of a hawk circling high above. It was a land that demanded respect, and often, took lives without a second thought. This was a time of uneasy peace, a fragile truce often shattered by skirmishes and misunderstandings between the burgeoning settlements of white prospectors and ranchers, and the indigenous Apache tribes who had called this land home for centuries. The echoes of Geronimo's raid still resonated, and distrust ran deep on both sides. The expansion of the railroad, the discovery of silver and copper, and the relentless push westward meant that the old ways were clashing violently with the new, leaving a trail of blood and broken promises. Survival was a daily struggle, and compassion, a luxury few could afford. Silas Miller, known to some as Dust for the way he seemed to appear and disappear like a desert whirlwind, was a man carved from the very landscape he inhabited. At 42, his face was a roadmap of sun-baked lines and weathered creases. His eyes, the color of faded denim, held a distant, haunted look. He was a drifter, a former scout for the cavalry who had seen too much bloodshed, too many broken treaties, and too many good men die for causes he no longer believed in. He carried the weight of unspoken regrets like a heavy saddlebag, and his only companions were his old mare, Shadow, and a Winchester rifle that had seen better days. He was a man who sought solitude, not because he disliked people, but because he found solace in the vast, indifferent silence of the desert, a silence that mirrored the one within himself. He had no family, no fixed abode, and no particular ambition beyond seeing the next sunrise. His current circumstances, however, were far from solitary. He had found himself, by a twist of fate and a desperate plea, embroiled in a situation that would test the very limits of his endurance and challenge the hardened shell he had built around his heart. A smallpox outbreak had swept through a remote Apache camp, decimating its inhabitants. A young Apache woman, barely more than a girl, had stumbled into a small, isolated trading post where Silas was briefly resting, her eyes wide with terror and desperation, carrying a feverish child. She spoke little English, but her pleas were universal. Her people were dying, and her son, Little Hawk, was fading fast. The nearest doctor was a 3-day ride away, across the most treacherous stretch of the Sonoran. The trader, a gruff but decent man named Jebediah Stone, had offered what little medicine he had, but it wasn't enough. He looked at Silas, a man known for his uncanny ability to navigate the desert, and a silent plea passed between them. Silas, who had sworn off involvement in such matters, found himself unable to turn away from the child's labored breathing and the mother's desperate gaze. He knew the risks. He knew the desert. And he knew, deep down, that this was a chance, perhaps his last, to outrun the ghosts that rode with him. The sun beat down with an oppressive fury, turning the air into a thick, shimmering haze. Silas, Dust, Miller stood outside Jebediah Stone's trading post, his gaze fixed on the distant, jagged peaks that marked the edge of the known world. Inside, the young Apache woman, whose name he learned was Naya, cradled her son, Little Hawk, his small body racked with fever. The child's skin was hot and dry, his breathing shallow, and the telltale rash of smallpox was beginning to bloom across his chest. Jebediah, a man whose face was as craggy as the desert mountains, emerged from the post, wiping sweat from his brow with a calloused hand. "He ain't got long, Dust," Jebediah said, his voice a low rumble. "That fever's burnin' him up faster than a prairie fire." Silas nodded, his jaw tight. He'd seen smallpox before, ravaged entire camps, left ghost towns in its wake. There was a Dr. Eleanor Vance, in the small mining town of Redemption Gulch, 3 days' ride east. But 3 days was an eternity for a child consumed by fever in the desert. "Naya says her people are dying," Jebediah continued, gesturing vaguely towards the west. "Whole camp's been hit. She walked 2 days to get here, carrying that boy. She's got grit, that one." Silas looked at the woman, her eyes pleading, her strength fading. He knew the journey would be brutal, even for a healthy man on horseback. For a sick child and a weary mother, it was a death sentence. "I'll go," Silas said, the word surprising even himself. He hadn't planned on getting involved, not after all he'd seen. But the child's innocent suffering, Naya's desperate hope, pricked at something long dormant within him. Jebediah's bushy eyebrows shot up. "You? Across the devil's backbone? That's a 3-day ride, even for Shadow. And you ain't got much water left." "I'll make it work," Silas replied, already turning towards his mare. "Naya, you stay here. Jebediah will look after you. I'll bring the doctor." Naya, understanding his intent, shook her head vehemently, clutching Little Hawk tighter. She spoke in broken English, pointing to herself and then to the child. "My son. I go." Silas hesitated. He knew the Apache's fierce devotion to their children. He also knew the journey would likely kill her and the boy. "No, Naya. You're too weak. The boy needs you to be strong when I get back." But her resolve was unyielding. Her eyes, though filled with tears, held a fire that matched the desert sun. Silas knew arguing was futile. "All right," he conceded, "but you ride Shadow." "I'll walk." Jebediah scoffed. "Walk? You're mad, Dust. You'll be buzzard bait before sundown." "I know this desert, Jebediah," Silas said, his voice flat. "And Shadow can only carry one. The child needs her strength." He began to prepare. He took his canteen, filled it with the last of Jebediah's water, and strapped it to Shadow's saddle. He checked his rifle, though he hoped he wouldn't need it. He looked at his boots, worn but sturdy, and a grim thought crossed his mind. He'd need them. As he was about to mount Shadow, a sudden, sharp pain shot through his right foot. He looked down to see a small, dark scorpion scuttling away from his boot. A dull ache spread quickly, followed by a burning sensation. He cursed under his breath. "Scorpion!" Jebediah exclaimed, rushing over. "Son of a gun, that's a bad one. You gotta get that poison out, Dust." Silas gritted his teeth, the pain intensifying. He knew the desert scorpions. Some were harmless, others could lay a man low for days, or worse. He pulled off his boot, his sock already damp with sweat. A small, angry red welt was forming on his instep. "No time," Silas muttered, trying to stand. The pain flared, making him wince. He tried to put weight on his foot, but it buckled. Jebediah looked at him, then at the feverish child, then back at Silas's swelling foot. "You can't ride, Dust. Not like that. You'll be useless." A cold dread settled in Silas's stomach. He had committed. He had made a promise, unspoken but understood. He looked at Naya, her face a mask of fear and hope. He looked at Little Hawk, his small chest heaving. Then, a decision, born of desperation and a lifetime of hard choices, solidified in his mind. He kicked off his other boot. "Then I'll walk barefoot." Jebediah stared, aghast. "Barefoot? Across the devil's backbone? You'll be dead in a day, man. Your feet will be raw meat." Silas ignored him. He took the reins of Shadow, his hand steady despite the throbbing pain in his foot. "Naya, you ride. Keep the boy cool. Don't stop for anything. I'll follow." Naya's eyes widened, a mixture of shock and dawning understanding. She saw the determination in his gaze, the grim resolve. She nodded, her voice a whisper, "Thank you, Dust." Silas helped her onto Shadow, carefully placing Little Hawk in her arms. He gave her the canteen. "Water is life. Don't waste a drop." With a final, resolute nod, Silas turned and began to walk, his bare feet sinking slightly into the hot sand. The scorpion's venom was already making his right foot throb, a constant, dull ache that promised to worsen. But he pushed it down, focusing on the path ahead, on the distant promise of Redemption Gulch. The sun beat down, the desert stretched endlessly, and Silas Miller, a man with nothing left to lose but his life, began his impossible journey. He was a cowboy, walking barefoot across the desert, to save an Apache child. The first few steps were agony, each grain of sand a tiny ember against his tender soles. But he kept moving, one foot in front of the other, Shadow and her precious cargo slowly pulling ahead. He was committed. The call had been answered. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and deep purple, Silas's feet were already a mess. Blisters had formed, then burst, leaving raw, exposed flesh. Every step was a fresh torment, a searing pain that radiated up his legs. He could feel the sharp edges of small rocks, the biting prick of desert thorns, the relentless heat of the sand. He focused on the tracks of Shadow, a faint trail in the shifting dunes, a beacon in his self-imposed ordeal. He remembered the first time he'd seen the desert truly angry. A sandstorm, years ago, had caught him unawares, burying his horse and nearly him along with it. He'd walked out of that, too, though with boots on. This felt different. This was a deliberate act of self-punishment, a penance for sins he couldn't name but felt in his bones. He thought of his past, the choices he'd made, the lives he'd touched and, sometimes, ruined. He'd been a young man once, full of fire and ambition, chasing the promise of gold and glory. He'd found neither, only dust and regret. He'd seen men driven mad by the desert, by loneliness, by the weight of their own consciences. He wondered if this journey would be his descent into that madness, or his salvation. He stumbled, catching himself on a saguaro, its spines pricking his hand. He pulled away, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The scorpion venom, though not lethal, was still working its way through his system, making him feel sluggish and nauseated. He knew he needed water, but the canteen was with Naya. He had given it all to them. His sacrifice had to be complete. He looked up at the stars, now beginning to pepper the vast, inky canvas of the night sky. They seemed impossibly bright, indifferent to his suffering. He thought of little Hawk, his small, feverish face. That child was his anchor, his reason. He couldn't fail. He wouldn't. He pushed on, the rhythm of his painful steps becoming a hypnotic chant in his mind. Left, right, left, right. Each step a prayer, each step a defiance. The desert was a cruel mistress, but he was a stubborn suitor. He would not yield. The second day dawned with a brutal efficiency, the sun leaping over the eastern horizon like a vengeful god. Silas had walked through the night, driven by a desperate urgency and a gnawing pain in his feet. His soles were a mangled mess of cuts, bruises, and embedded thorns. Each step was a fresh agony, a testament to the desert's relentless cruelty. His right foot, still swollen from the scorpion's sting, throbbed with a dull, persistent ache that made him limp unevenly. He was thirsty, his throat raw, his lips cracked and bleeding. He found Shadow's tracks leading towards a narrow pass, a winding trail through jagged rock formations known as the Serpent's Coil. It was a treacherous path, even for a horse, with loose scree and sudden drops. He knew Naya would have to navigate it carefully, especially with the sick child. He hoped she had conserved the water. As he entered the pass, the air grew heavy, trapped between the towering rock walls. The sun, though still low, reflected off the stone, intensifying the heat. He saw signs of recent passage, a dislodged rock, a faint hoof print in a patch of dust. He was still on their trail. Suddenly, a low growl echoed from behind a cluster of boulders. Silas froze, his hand instinctively going to where his rifle should have been. He remembered he had left it with Shadow, strapped to the saddle. He was unarmed. A large, gaunt coyote emerged, its eyes gleaming with hunger. It was not a lone hunter, but a scavenger, drawn by the scent of weakness, or perhaps, the faint scent of blood from his feet. It circled him warily, its hackles raised. Silas knew better than to run. He stood his ground, trying to project an air of strength he didn't feel. "Go on, varmint," he rasped, his voice hoarse. "Ain't nothing for you here." The coyote let out another growl, a challenge. It took a tentative step forward. Silas knew he was in trouble. He was weak, injured, and unarmed. A single coyote might be deterred, but a hungry one, sensing vulnerability, could be dangerous. Just then, a sharp crack echoed through the pass. A bullet whizzed past the coyote's head, kicking up dust. The animal yelped and bolted, disappearing among the rocks. Silas spun around, squinting against the glare. Standing on a high ledge, silhouetted against the sky, was a figure. A man, holding a rifle. As he descended, Silas recognized him. It was Elias Thorne, a bounty hunter known for his ruthless efficiency and his cold, calculating demeanor. Thorne was a man Silas had crossed paths with before, never on friendly terms. Thorne, a lean man with eyes like chips of ice, approached, his rifle still casually held. Well, if it ain't Dust Miller," he drawled, a sneer playing on his lips. "Heard you'd gone soft, but walking barefoot in the desert. That's a new low, even for you." Silas said nothing, his gaze unwavering. He knew Thorne was a dangerous man, driven by money and a twisted sense of justice. "What's the matter, Miller? Lose your boots in a poker game?" Thorne chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Or are you finally paying for all those sins you've been piling up?" "I'm on a mission," Thorn, Silas said, his voice strained. Stay out of my way. Thorn raised an eyebrow. A mission? You. Last I heard, your only mission was to drown your sorrows in cheap whiskey. What's so important it's got you hobbling like a crippled dog? Silas hesitated. He knew Thorn had no love for Apache, or any native for that matter. Revealing his purpose would likely put the child in even greater danger. None of your business. Thorn's eyes narrowed. Everything in this desert is my business, Miller. Especially when it smells like trouble. I saw a squaw and a child on a horse heading this way earlier. That got anything to do with your barefoot pilgrimage? Silas remained silent, his face a mask. Thorn, however, was perceptive. He saw the flicker of concern in Silas's eyes, the way his gaze darted towards the direction Naya had gone. Ah, I see, Thorn said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. You're playing savior. An Apache child, no less. That's rich. What's the bounty on that one, Miller? Or are you just trying to clear your conscience? Leave them alone, Thorn, Silas warned, his voice low and dangerous. They're sick. They need help. Help? Thorn scoffed. The only help those savages need is a one-way ticket to the happy hunting grounds. They're nothing but trouble, Miller. Always have been. He took a step closer, his rifle still pointed casually in Silas's direction. Now, tell me what you're really up to. Or I'll leave you here for the buzzards, and then I'll go find that squaw and her brat myself. Silas knew he was in a precarious position. He was injured, unarmed, and facing a man who wouldn't hesitate to kill him. But he couldn't let Thorn get to Naya and Little Hawk. He had to buy them time. It's a long story, Thorn, Silas said, trying to keep his voice steady. And it involves a map. A map to a lost silver mine, hidden deep in these mountains. The Apache woman, she knows the way. Thorn's eyes gleamed with avarice. A silver mine, you say? Now that's a story I'm interested in. Why didn't you say so? Silas began to weave a tale, a desperate fabrication born of necessity. He spoke of an old prospector, a dying man who had given him a cryptic map, a map that only an Apache, one who knew the ancient trails, could decipher. He painted a picture of untold riches, enough to make a man rich beyond his wildest dreams. He knew Thorn's weakness was greed. Thorn listened, his suspicion warring with his desire for wealth. And the child? What's he got to do with it? The child is a distraction, Silas lied smoothly. The woman uses him to appear harmless, to throw off anyone who might be following her. She's cunning, Thorn. She's been leading me on a wild goose chase, trying to lose me. Thorn considered this, his gaze shifting between Silas and the direction Naya had taken. So, you want me to help you track her, then? And we split the silver? Exactly, Silas said, trying to sound convincing. But we have to be careful. She's got eyes and ears everywhere. We can't let her know we're onto her. Thorn grinned, a predatory flash of teeth. I like the sound of that, Miller. A little cat and mouse game, with a silver mine at the end. All right, I'll play. But don't try any funny business. I'll be watching you. Silas felt a surge of relief, quickly followed by a wave of exhaustion. He had bought Naya and Little Hawk some time, but he had also entangled himself with a dangerous predator. He knew Thorn would eventually realize he was being played, and when that happened, the consequences would be dire. But for now, he had to keep moving, keep the lie alive, and keep Thorn away from the child. He began to walk again, the pain in his feet a constant reminder of his desperate gamble. Thorn followed, his rifle still at the ready, his eyes scanning the desert for any sign of the Apache woman and the promise of silver. The journey had just become infinitely more complicated. As the day wore on, the heat intensified, and Silas's condition worsened. The scorpion venom made him lightheaded, and the constant pain from his feet was a relentless hammer against his will. He stumbled frequently, his vision blurring at the edges. Thorn, ever vigilant, watched him like a hawk, occasionally offering a sarcastic comment about his dedication to the silver hunt. "You're lookin' a bit green, Miller," Thorn observed, his voice devoid of sympathy. "Sure you can keep up with that wily squaw?" Silas merely grunted in response, conserving his energy. He knew he couldn't afford to show weakness, not to Thorn. He focused on the ground, searching for any sign that Naya might have left for him, a small marker, a broken branch, anything to confirm she was still ahead and safe. He found nothing, which was both a relief and a worry. It meant she was being careful, but also that he was truly alone in tracking her. They reached a small, dry wash, its bed cracked and parched. Silas knew there might be a seep spring further up, a tiny trickle of water hidden beneath the rocks. It was a long shot, but he was desperate. "We need water," Silas rasped, his throat feeling like sandpaper. Thorn scoffed. "You think I don't know that? We'll find some. But we ain't stopping for long. That silver ain't gonna dig itself up." Silas ignored him, his eyes scanning the rocks. He remembered a time, years ago, when he'd been stranded in this very wash, near death from thirst. An old Apache elder had found him, shared his meager water, and shown him how to find the hidden springs. He closed his eyes, trying to recall the exact location, the subtle signs. He found it, a small patch of damp sand beneath an overhang, barely visible. He began to dig with his bare hands, the sharp rocks tearing at his already mangled fingers. Thorn watched, unimpressed. "You're wasting time, Miller," Thorn said impatiently. "That's barely enough to wet a bird's beak." But Silas kept digging, his determination fueled by the memory of the elder's kindness. Slowly, a small pool of muddy water began to collect. It was brackish, warm, and filled with sediment, but it was water. He cupped his hands, brought it to his lips, and drank deeply, ignoring the taste, focusing only on the blessed relief it offered. Thorn, seeing the water, grudgingly knelt and took a few sips. "Still not enough to keep a man going for long," he grumbled. "You sure this squaw knows where she's going, or is she just leading us to our graves?" "She knows," Silas lied, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "She's testing us, seeing if we're worthy of the treasure." Thorn grunted, but the lure of silver was strong. He stood, his gaze sweeping the horizon. "All right, let's move. We can't let her get too far ahead." Silas pushed himself up, his body screaming in protest. He knew he was playing a dangerous game, but he had no other choice. He had to keep Thorn distracted, keep him believing in the phantom silver mine, until Naya and Little Hawk were safe in Redemption Gulch. He just hoped he could last that long. The desert, however, had a way of revealing truths, and Silas knew his deception wouldn't hold forever. The third day brought no respite. Silas's feet were a raw, infected mess, each step a fresh wave of nausea and agony. The scorpion venom had subsided, but the pain from his feet was a constant, throbbing drumbeat. He was severely dehydrated, his body trembling with exhaustion. Thorn, meanwhile, was growing increasingly suspicious. The signs of the Apache woman's passage were becoming scarcer, and the promised silver mine remained elusive. They were traversing a vast, flat expanse of sun-baked earth, where the heat rose in shimmering waves, making the air dance. There was no cover, no shade, just endless, unforgiving terrain. "Miller, this is getting old," Thorn growled, his voice laced with menace. "We've been chasing ghosts for 2 days. Where's this wily squaw and her map? Or are you just leading me on a fool's errand?" Silas stumbled, catching himself before he fell. "She's clever, Thorn," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "She knows these lands better than anyone. We're close. I can feel it." He pointed vaguely towards a distant mesa. The old prospector mentioned a sleeping giant in the distance. "That's it. The mine is beyond it." Thorn squinted at the mesa, his eyes narrowed. He was clearly torn between his growing suspicion and the tantalizing promise of silver. "If you're lying to me, Miller, I'll make sure you regret it." Slowly. As they continued, the ground beneath their feet began to change. The sand gave way to rocky, uneven terrain, then to a field of sharp, volcanic rock, black and jagged like broken glass. Silas's bare feet, already shredded, were now being flayed anew with every step. He bit back cries of pain, his face a mask of grim determination. Suddenly, a distant plume of smoke rose into the sky, far to the north. Thorn saw it too. "What's that?" Thorn asked, his hand going to his rifle. "Apache signal fire." Silas's heart pounded. He knew it was too far for Naya to have made it to any Apache camp. "Could be," he said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Maybe another tribe. Or just a brush fire." But Thorn's gaze was fixed on the smoke, a new suspicion dawning in his eyes. "Or maybe," he said slowly, "that's where your wily squaw is really headed. Not for some phantom silver mine, but to her own people. And that child is sick, isn't he? Smallpox." Silas knew the game was up. Thorn had put the pieces together. The sick child, the desperate journey, his own Barefoot sacrifice, it all pointed to the truth. "They need help, Thorn," Silas admitted, his voice hoarse. "The child is dying. I'm taking them to a doctor." Thorn let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "A doctor? For a savage brat? You've gone completely mad, Miller. All this for a squaw and her sick pup. You really have gone soft." His face hardened, a cold fury replacing his earlier amusement. "You lied to me. You wasted my time. And for what? To save an Apache? They're nothing but vermin, Miller. They deserve to die." He raised his rifle, pointing it directly at Silas's chest. "Now, where are they headed? Tell me, or I'll put a bullet in you right here, and then I'll track them down myself. And believe me, I won't be bringing them to no doctor." Silas stood his ground, his bare feet bleeding on the sharp rock. He looked into Thorn's cold, merciless eyes. He knew this was the end of his journey, one way or another. But he wouldn't betray Naya and Little Hawk. "I won't tell you," Silas said, his voice surprisingly strong despite his exhaustion. "You'll have to kill me first." Thorn's finger tightened on the trigger. "Don't tempt me, Miller. I've killed better men than you for less." Just then, a faint sound reached their ears, the distant whinny of a horse. It was Shadow. Naya must have been closer than Silas thought, perhaps having taken a slightly different, less direct route to avoid detection. Thorn's head snapped up, his eyes darting towards the sound. "There they are," he snarled. "You led me right to them, you fool." He lowered his rifle from Silas, but only to turn and begin moving quickly in the direction of the sound. "Stay here, Miller. If you try to follow, I'll put a bullet in your back. And then I'll deal with the squaw and her brat." Silas watched him go, his heart sinking. He had failed. He had bought them time, but now Thorn was on their trail, and he was too weak, too injured, to stop him. Despair threatened to overwhelm him. He sank to his knees, his body trembling, his feet burning with an unbearable pain. He had pushed himself to the brink, sacrificed everything, and it was all for nothing. But then, a flicker of defiance ignited within him. He had come this far. He had endured the desert, the pain, the hunger, the thirst. He wouldn't give up now. Not when Little Hawk's life hung in the balance. He looked at his mangled feet, then at the direction Thorn had gone. He had to try. He had to warn them. With a guttural cry, Silas pushed himself back up. Each step was a fresh agony, but he forced himself forward, hobbling over the sharp volcanic rock, leaving a trail of blood in his wake. He was no longer just a man walking barefoot across the desert, he was a wounded animal, driven by a primal instinct to protect. He had to reach them before Thorn did. The stakes were higher than ever, and Silas knew this was a race against time, against a ruthless killer, and against his own failing body. The desert, it seemed, was not yet done with him. As he stumbled forward, the sun began its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the desolate landscape. The air grew cooler, but the relief was minimal against the burning inferno of his feet. He could hear the faint sounds of Thorn's progress, the occasional clatter of a dislodged rock, the distant whinny of shadow. He was gaining on them, but Silas knew Thorn was faster, unburdened by injury. He reached a small, rocky outcrop, and from its vantage point, he saw them. Naya, dismounted, was trying to soothe Little Hawk, who was clearly worse. Shadow stood patiently nearby. And then, Thorn emerged from behind a cluster of saguaros, his rifle raised, a cruel smile on his face. "Well, well, look what we have here," Thorn's voice carried on the evening breeze. "The little family reunion. And just in time for the fireworks." Naya gasped, clutching Little Hawk tighter. Her eyes, wide with fear, darted between Thorn and the approaching Silas. Silas yelled, a raw, desperate sound, "Naya! Run! He's got a rifle." But it was too late. Thorn had them cornered. He aimed his rifle at Naya. "Drop the child, squaw. And don't try anything foolish." Naya, despite her fear, held Little Hawk protectively. She wouldn't surrender her son. Silas, seeing Thorn's intent, knew he had to act. He was unarmed, his body broken, but he had one last desperate gamble. He looked around, his eyes searching for anything, any advantage. He saw a pile of loose rocks near his position. "Thorn! Leave them alone!" Silas screamed, trying to draw his attention. Thorn glanced at Silas, a look of contempt on his face. "You're too late, Miller. This is where your little mission ends." He turned his rifle back to Naya. Silas didn't hesitate. With a surge of adrenaline, he grabbed a handful of sharp, jagged rocks. With a desperate cry, he hurled them at Thorn, aiming for his head. The rocks clattered harmlessly against Thorn's shoulder, but the sudden distraction was enough. Thorn flinched, his shot going wide, kicking up dust near Naya's feet. In that split second, Naya saw her chance. She scrambled onto Shadow, pulling Little Hawk with her, and spurred the mare forward, galloping away into the fading light. Thorn cursed, turning his rifle on Silas. "You interfering fool. Now you're really going to pay." Silas knew he had bought Naya and Little Hawk a few precious moments, but at a terrible cost. Thorn's eyes were filled with murderous rage. This was the confrontation he had feared, and he was utterly unprepared. Thorn, enraged by Silas's interference and the escape of Naya and Little Hawk, turned his full fury on the Barefoot cowboy. "You think you're a hero, Miller? You're just a dead man walking," he snarled, raising his rifle. Silas, his body screaming in protest, knew he couldn't outrun Thorn, nor could he fight him unarmed in his current state. He had to think, and fast. His eyes darted around, searching for any advantage in the desolate landscape. They were still in the field of sharp volcanic rock, a terrain that was agony for his bare feet, but also treacherous for anyone moving quickly. "You won't catch them, Thorn," Silas taunted, trying to buy more time, to draw Thorn's focus solely on him. "They're faster than you think, and they know these trails better than any white man." Thorn fired, the bullet whistling past Silas's ear, kicking up a spray of rock fragments. Silas dove behind a small, jagged outcropping, his body protesting every movement. The sharp edges of the rock tore at his skin, but he barely registered the new pain. "Come out, Miller. You can't hide forever," Thorn yelled, his voice echoing through the twilight. He began to circle, his movements swift and predatory, his rifle held ready. Silas knew he was trapped. He was bleeding, exhausted, and unarmed. But he also knew Thorn's arrogance. Thorn saw him as a broken man, easy prey. That might be his only chance. As Thorn moved closer, Silas noticed a loose pile of rocks near his position, precariously balanced. An idea, desperate and dangerous, formed in his mind. He had to get Thorn close enough. "You're a fool, Thorn," Silas shouted, his voice raspy. "You chase shadows while real treasure slips through your fingers." Thorn paused, his curiosity piqued despite his rage. "What treasure, Miller? You're still spouting that silver mine nonsense." "Not silver," Silas gasped, feigning weakness. "Something far more valuable. Something the Apache have guarded for centuries. A secret spring, deep underground, with water that can heal any sickness. That's why the child is so important. He's the key to finding it." Thorn's eyes widened. A healing spring? In this desert? It sounded like a tall tale, but the lure of such a prize, especially one that could be exploited, was too strong to ignore. He lowered his rifle slightly, his greed momentarily overriding his bloodlust. "Where is it?" Thorn demanded, taking another step closer, his gaze sweeping the ground around Silas's hiding spot. "Tell me, Miller, and I might just let you live." "It's here," Silas whispered, pointing vaguely towards the precarious rock pile. "Beneath these rocks. But only an Apache can reveal its true path. The child, he has the gift." Thorn, his eyes gleaming with avarice, took another step, his attention fully on the supposed spring. He was now within striking distance. Silas waited for the precise moment. As Thorn stepped onto a particularly unstable patch of ground near the rock pile, Silas lunged, not at Thorn, but at the base of the precarious stack of rocks. With a desperate shove, he sent the entire pile tumbling down. A cascade of sharp, heavy stones crashed down, catching Thorn by surprise. He cried out, stumbling backward, his rifle flying from his grasp. One large rock struck his leg, sending him sprawling to the ground with a yelp of pain. Silas, despite his own injuries, scrambled forward, ignoring the searing pain in his feet. He reached Thorn's rifle, snatching it up. He turned it on the bounty hunter, who was now clutching his injured leg, his face contorted in pain and shock. "Don't move, Thorn," Silas said, his voice low and steady, the rifle feeling heavy and familiar in his hands. "It's over." Thorn glared at him, his eyes still burning with hatred. "You tricked me, you bastard." "You were too greedy to see the truth," Silas retorted, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. "Now, stay put. I'm going after Naya and Little Hawk. And if I see you follow, I won't hesitate." Thorn, clutching his leg, knew he was beaten. For now. He watched Silas hobble away, the rifle held defensively. The setting sun cast long shadows, painting the scene in hues of orange and purple. Silas had won this round, but the desert was still a dangerous place, and Thorn was a man who held grudges. Silas, now armed, pushed himself forward, the adrenaline slowly fading, replaced by a crushing wave of exhaustion. He had faced Thorn and survived, but the encounter had taken its toll. His feet were screaming, his body was failing, but he had to keep moving. He had to find Naya and Little Hawk. He had to get them to Redemption Gulch. The doctor. That was his only thought. He followed the faint tracks of shadow, now barely visible in the deepening twilight. The air grew colder, the desert night beginning to settle in. He knew the dangers of the desert after dark: the predators, the sudden drops in temperature, the disorientation. But he couldn't stop. He stumbled upon them near a small, sheltered alcove in the rocks. Naya was huddled over Little Hawk, trying to keep him warm. The child's breathing was shallow, his small body trembling. He was worse. "Naya," Silas whispered, his voice hoarse. She looked up, her eyes wide with fear, then relief as she saw him, and the rifle in his hand. "Dust. You came back." Silas knelt beside them, ignoring the pain. He checked Little Hawk, his heart sinking. The fever was raging, the smallpox rash more pronounced. The child was fading fast. "We have to go," Silas urged, his voice filled with a new urgency. "Redemption Gulch. It's not far now. Maybe a few hours." Naya nodded, tears streaming down her face. She knew the child was dying. She knew this was their last hope. Silas helped her onto Shadow, carefully placing Little Hawk in her arms. He then took the reins, leading the mare forward. He was still barefoot, still injured, but now he had a rifle, and a renewed sense of purpose. He had faced his demons, both internal and external, and he had chosen to fight. The desert night was cold and unforgiving, but Silas Miller, the barefoot cowboy, would not yield. He would get them to the doctor, or he would die trying. The final stretch of his impossible journey had begun. As they moved through the cold desert night, Silas's mind was a blur of pain and determination. He focused on the distant lights of Redemption Gulch, a faint glow on the horizon that seemed to mock his slow progress. He could feel Little Hawk's feverish breath, hear his shallow gasps. Time was running out. He stumbled, falling to his knees. Naya cried out, "Dust. Are you all right?" Silas pushed himself up, gritting his teeth. "Just tired," he lied. His feet were numb with pain, but he forced himself to keep moving. He knew he was pushing his body beyond its limits, but the thought of Little Hawk, the image of Naya's desperate face, spurred him on. He remembered the old Apache elder who had saved him years ago. The elder had spoken of the desert as a teacher, a place where a man could find his true self, or lose it forever. Silas felt like he was doing both. He was losing the hardened, cynical man he had become, and finding something else, something he hadn't known was still there. They finally reached the outskirts of Redemption Gulch as the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky. The town was a collection of rough-hewn buildings, a few saloons, a general store, and a small clinic. The lights were still on in the clinic, a beacon of hope in the fading darkness. Silas pushed through the last of his strength, leading Shadow directly to the clinic door. He pounded on it, his knuckles raw. A moment later, the door opened, revealing a stern-faced woman with spectacles perched on her nose. Dr. Eleanor Vance, a woman known for her sharp mind and even sharper tongue, but also for her unwavering dedication to healing. Her eyes, initially filled with annoyance at the early disturbance, widened as she saw the sight before her, a barefoot, bloodied cowboy, holding a rifle, and a terrified Apache woman cradling a dying child. "Doctor," Silas gasped, his voice barely audible. "The child, smallpox. He needs your help." Dr. Vance, despite the shock, quickly assessed the situation. She saw the desperation in Silas's eyes, the fever in Little Hawk's small body. She was a doctor, and a life was at stake. "Bring him in," she commanded, her voice firm. "Quickly." Silas helped Naya dismount, carefully handing Little Hawk over to the doctor. As the child was carried inside, Silas felt a wave of relief so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. He had done it. He had brought them to safety. He leaned against the doorframe, his body trembling, his feet burning. He looked up at the sky, the first rays of the sun touching his face. He had walked barefoot across the desert, through pain and deception, to save an Apache child. And in doing so, he had found a flicker of redemption for himself. The next few days were a blur for Silas. He collapsed outside Dr. Vance's clinic, his body finally giving out. He awoke in a small cot inside, his feet bandaged, his body aching in every conceivable way. Dr. Vance, a woman of few words but immense capability, had seen to his injuries, cleaning his wounds and bandaging his raw feet. She had also given him a stern lecture about the foolishness of walking barefoot across the desert, even for a noble cause. "You're lucky you didn't lose those feet, Mr. Miller," she had said, her voice crisp. Infection was setting in. And that scorpion sting could have been worse. "What in the good Lord's name possessed you?" Silas had simply looked at her, his eyes conveying the unspoken answer. He learned that Little Hawk was still fighting for his life. Dr. Vance had worked tirelessly, using every ounce of her knowledge and what little medicine she had to combat the smallpox. Naya remained by her son's side, a silent, watchful presence, her hope clinging to every breath Little Hawk took. Word of Silas's incredible journey, and the Apache child, spread quickly through Redemption Gulch. The townspeople, a mix of hardened miners, wary merchants, and a few decent folk, reacted with a mixture of suspicion, awe, and grudging respect. Some grumbled about an Apache child being brought into their town, fearing contagion or trouble. Others, however, were moved by the sheer audacity of Silas's sacrifice. One afternoon, Jebediah Stone arrived, having followed Silas's trail, albeit at a much slower pace. He found Silas sitting on the clinic porch, his feet propped up, looking out at the dusty street. "Heard you made it, Dust," Jebediah said, his voice gruff but with an underlying tone of admiration. "And you brought the doctor a heap of trouble, by the looks of it." Silas managed a weak smile. "Trouble's my middle name, Jebediah." "How's Naya?" "She's strong," Jebediah replied. "Stronger than most men I know. And the boy, well, Dr. Vance says he's got a fighting chance." "Thanks to you." Silas looked away, uncomfortable with the praise. "I just did what needed doing." "No, Dust," Jebediah said, shaking his head. "Most men wouldn't have done it. Especially not for an Apache. You did good, son. Real good." A few days later, the news came. Little Hawk was going to live. The fever had broken, the rash was fading, and though weak, the child was on the mend. Naya, her face streaked with tears of relief, emerged from the clinic, her eyes finding Silas. She walked over to him, and without a word, she knelt and took his bandaged hands, pressing them to her forehead in a gesture of profound gratitude. "My son lives," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved him, Dust. You walked through fire for him." Silas felt a warmth spread through him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't the warmth of the desert sun, but something deeper, more profound. It was the warmth of purpose, of having made a difference. As Little Hawk slowly recovered, the town began to see him not as an Apache child, but simply as a child who had been sick, and who had been saved by an extraordinary act of courage. Dr. Vance, ever practical, ensured that the boy and his mother were cared for, and even gave Naya some basic medical supplies to take back to her people, along with instructions on how to prevent further spread of the disease. Silas, his feet slowly healing, knew his time in Redemption Gulch was drawing to a close. He was still a drifter, a man of the desert, but something had changed within him. The ghosts that had ridden with him for so long seemed a little less heavy, their whispers a little less insistent. He had found a measure of peace, not in forgetting his past, but in redeeming a small part of it. Before Naya and Little Hawk left, Silas spoke with her. "Your people, they'll be safe." Naya nodded. "The doctor's medicine will help. And the story of the Barefoot Cowboy, it will be told. It will bring understanding." Silas watched them ride away, Naya on Shadow, Little Hawk nestled safely in her arms, a small, healthy child now. He felt a pang of something akin to hope. He didn't know where he would go next, or what the future held. But he knew he would keep walking, perhaps with boots this time, but with a lighter heart. The desert had tested him, stripped him bare, and in doing so, had shown him the true measure of a man. And so concludes the incredible tale of Silas "Dust" Miller, the cowboy who walked barefoot across the desert to save an Apache child, a story of sacrifice, redemption, and the unexpected bonds forged in the crucible of the American frontier. Dear listeners of Gunpowder Legends, I hope this tale kept you on the edge of your saddle. If this story of the Old West resonated with you, don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to the Gunpowder Legends channel, where every week we bring you the most remarkable and thrilling stories from the American frontier. Remember that all the stories we tell here on Gunpowder Legends are works of fiction, though some may be inspired by real events or frontier legends. Our goal is to entertain you and make you experience the spirit and emotion of the untamed West from the comfort of your home. Until next time, and may your trails be safe. See you in the next episode of Gunpowder Legends.